have this recording. Okay, before we get into the meat of things, we are now recording. So we renewed the 1200Z per federal regulations. We have to renew every 5 years. All NPDES permits must be renewed every 5 years. We renewed the current permit in August of 2017. And then shortly thereafter, we received a lawsuit to reconsider the permit and then a reconsideration petition. And those parties intervened together, and we went through about 7 months or 10 months of settlement talks with the parties. And we came to a settlement agreement in August 17th of 2018. The settlement agreement had short-term conditions that we had to reissue the 2017 permit and include all these short-term conditions, which we did in October of 2018. And then there were long-term conditions that we had to consider. And so we began our rulemaking on February of 2019 to consider all the long-term changes to the industrial permit based on a consent decree and the settlement terms. The settlement terms included timelines for us to reissue the permit early. So the draft permit had to be issued by October 2020, and we needed to issue or adopt a final permit by March 2021. So the rulemaking timelines, we have authority under our administrative rules to adopt these permits by rule or order. The agency decided to issue this iteration of the permit by rule, which means a very long process of advisory committee meetings and environmental commission adoption. So we started our meetings in May of 2019, and we ended in June of 2020. We started the public hearing a little before the consent decree's deadline for us to submit a draft permit for public notice due to the March deadline of having a final permit. In order to address the comments and in order to make the timeline of issuing by the March 30th, we issued the draft permit early on August 17th, and we held the public notice period open till October 30th, 2020. Permit was adopted by our Environmental Quality Commission on March 21st. And in order to have great webinars like this and to get assignment letters out, and in order to start the permit at the beginning of a monitoring year, we decided to make the permit's effective date July 1, 2021. These are the members that served on our advisory committee. We really appreciate all their efforts and input. Each meeting was about 6.5 hours. And our last few meetings, because of the pandemic, did go virtual. So we used Microsoft Teams and Microsoft Zoom. I will pause here because there is another question about eligibility for the permit. I will let Blair read it this time.
Sure. Once again, another anonymous attendee asks, if stormwater, industrial wastewater, and community runoff all combine into a holding structure prior to discharge, can the facility have an individual permit instead of a 12Z permit to deal with all discharges?
That's a great question. And yes, if you do have industrial wastewater, you are ineligible for the 1200Z. The 1200Z is strictly for stormwater discharge, industrial stormwater discharge. And even if you have a construction activity, you must get the 1200C for construction stormwater discharge. So again, the 1200Z is for industrial discharge with some authorized non-stormwater discharges that are listed in the permit, such as groundwater, but not industrial wastewater. We have a couple more questions that we will hold until we get to those slides. One about mass reduction and one about monitoring letters and impairment assignment. So again, we had 6 meetings focused on the settlement terms. So the settlement terms required DEQ to review the National Academies of Science report on the EPA's permit. So prior to our lawsuit and our settlement terms, EPA issued the federal permit, which is an industrial stormwater permit that applies to pretty small area in our nation. Most states have been delegated the authority, and most states write their own iteration of the stormwater industrial permit. However, the MSGP, which is the multi-sector general permit, is EPA's overarching federal industrial stormwater permit. And they had their own lawsuit, and under their settlement terms, they were required to pay for and consider many conditions in their permit, and to solicit and to take the recommendations from this very it was a consensus report, and it was very, very robust. So this National Academies of Science report again was on the federal permit, and we were required in our settlement to consider many of the conditions and recommendations in that report. We also were required to consider Washington State Ecology's methodology for water quality numeric effluent limits. So Washington State does have some water quality numeric limits, also applicable to 303D listed or category 5 impaired waters. And we had some good conversations and presented on their methodology and the way that they came about putting those limits into their permit. We were required to consider numeric effluent limits, both water quality and technology limits. For water quality limits, we were required to look at the 303D listed impaired waters. And for technology-based limits, we were required to consider copper, lead, zinc, and total suspended solids. Also, once we were able to kind of hone down the where we were going to land in the 1200Z applicable to these, we were required to draft related monitoring and reporting requirements based on benchmarks or limits. So the rulemaking record can be found at this link. This is our industrial stormwater discharge permit rulemaking webpage. You can see there is the draft permit there. There is presentations that we presented, an informational presentation at our we had during the public notice period, we had we had an informational presentation, and we also had a couple of presentations we gave to the Environmental Commission, so Quality Commission. So those are there. And then we have the whole rule packet and the staff report, which a staff report just includes a bunch of background and really good information on how we got to where we are. These are drop downs here. So the 1200Z permit rulemaking advisory meetings, you'll find all the meeting presentations, all the meeting summaries, and just a whole bunch of information if you would like to dig into where we've been and how we got here. We also have an industrial stormwater permits page. Hopefully most of you have seen this, and there we include the permit that was renewed on March 25th by rule, becoming effective on July 1st, 2021. The final permit evaluation report, which is the rationale and some in the background of how we came to the permit conditions. You'll find the response to comments and a summary of changes. We also created a map to help people figure out what georegion you're in and which impaired, and if you discharge to an impaired waterway. And then there's the 2021 revised SWIP checklist. So you will need to fill that out and submit that with your revised plan, which is due the end of August. I will pause here for a minute to see how we're doing on questions, Blair.
Yeah, I'm glad you did. We're getting quite a few. I think one that is relevant to what you're talking about currently is from an anonymous attendee. Why are changes to the 12Z permit program being driven by judicial action other than legislative action by lawmakers in Salem? It seems that any environmental group can bring a lawsuit against DEQ to change and influence regulatory programs.
Yes, great question. This is just the nature of how permitting and federal and state regulations go. Like I mentioned, the federal regulations, which are mandated by Clean Water Act and federal legislation on and Congress's authority on the federal side, those come down to the states to implement. So there is a lot of I guess participation on the federal level as far as Clean Water Act and federal regulations. As far as the state mandating how we regulate facilities, there's less of that because we are a delegated authority. We are a delegated state agency that implements federal rules that are made on the more, executive level. So I will say us doing this by rulemaking has enhanced, hopefully, people participated in the rulemaking process. There were all the advisory committee meetings are open to the public. Obviously, the litigants participated and were part of the advisory committee. Having this permit adopted to our administrative rules, Oregon's administrative rules, limits the litigation that can happen going forward because our policy board, our Environmental Quality Commission adopted this permit.
Great, thanks, Krista. We're getting a few more questions about guidance and fact sheets, so I'll ask those. And we have quite a few questions about Tier 2 requirements and checklists, so we can hold off on those until we hit the appropriate slide. But Mal Foster, an employee from there, would like to know, will DEQ issue a fact sheet or guidance outlining the details of the methodology of the evaluation?
So that is available in the permit evaluation report. We do talk about how we came to include water quality-based effluent limits in the permit. In addition, the rulemaking webpage, we discussed technology-based and water quality-based limits in, very complete, or, we went very deep into federal rules and state rules and Oregon's water quality standards and how to implement these and how to regulate effluent limits in a general industrial stormwater permit. So all that is also available to you in the rulemaking record. The meeting 3 and 4 were kind of the meat of the methodology and the limit discussion.
And this is not really a question, but Justine Miller had a comment about the previous question about environmental groups being able to bring forth a lawsuit. And she says it's because of the structural design of administrative law and the role of agencies being a quasi branch of government. Environmental groups can have the privilege of participation under the terms of standing at hand. So that might augment the answer to the previous question. Let me look quickly for more in this particular area. Will a red line of the permit be issued once to be known by an anonymous attendee?
Unfortunately, due to the structural changes, all the monitoring tables have been moved to Schedule B, and there were just too many changes to make a red line that would really not be a complete mess. Plus, as any of you that have worked in a Word document template of sorts, when you do a track changes, even if you do it at the end of the final documents, it just really didn't show well, and it was just extremely messy and not something that we'll be able to provide at this time. Hopefully, if you you can do a compare yourself. If you've ever been able to do that, if you have Adobe, you can convert the PDFs to Word and do a compare through the Word function. It's just not something we'll be able to provide because of the multiple changes and the structural changes to the permit.
And with that, Krista, the rest of the questions are general that we can pretty much answer at the end, I think, or very specific to pollutant parameters, benchmarks, numeric limits, and tier 2s, as I said, so we can hold off on those until you hit the appropriate slide.
Perfect. Thank you, Blair.
Sure.
All right, so the draft permit went out. We received 390 comments from 37 different entities. We made modifications from the draft to the final permit based on 143 comments. Of course, all comments were considered. One of the advantages of doing the rulemaking is we are bound by the Administrative Procedures Act. So there are, besides all the federal rules for NPDES permitting and federal regulations, we are also, during this process, we're bound by a whole rulemaking set of rules and guidelines. And again, like I said, all the advisory committees were open under public meetings law, and all the comments needed to be considered, which we do all the time anyway, but there was another set of factors that we considered under the Administrative Procedures Act. Of course, some of the proposed permit conditions that were in that draft were not finalized. And one of the factors that played into that were some of the conditions in the 1200Z draft were based on the EPA's draft multi-sector general permit. And as the timing of their renewal and the timing of our renewal, we were able to have a final federal permit prior to our final permit. So some of the conditions that were in the draft permit were based on the draft federal permit. And when they didn't finalize some of those conditions, we also did not finalize some of those conditions. So some of the conditions that were not finalized in the permit that was adopted at the end of March was Tier 1.5 and Appendix B. So those no longer are in the permit, and were a couple of the conditions that were formulated after EPA's permit, and they didn't finalize it was called Appendix Q, and therefore we also did not finalize Appendix B, which was a checklist of many source and operational controls based on certain industrial sectors. Another item that was in the draft permit that didn't make it into the final permit was changing the sampling frequency in between when you take a sample to 72 hours. That continues to be in the permit at a 14 days between sample collection. There was also, based on the federal permit, additional sector specific benchmarks for sector O, which is the oil and oil and gas industry, sector P, which is, let's see, I have my permit here. Why can't I remember? Sector P is transportation. Come on. And sector R, which is the shipbuilding sector. Those at this time don't have any additional sector-specific benchmarks. Sector P is the land, transportation, and warehousing sector. So in the draft permit, there were some additional sector-specific benchmarks for those, but those were not finalized because EPA did not finalize those. And our Schedule E, our sector-specific section of the permit, which is pretty much the bulk of our permit, it starts on page 46 and continues to page 144. So those pages of the permit are adopted directly from EPA, from the multi-sector permits. So we have yet to expand on any additional benchmarks that are not in EPA's federal permits. So, and then again, the federal permit was adopted in between our draft and final permit. So that was nice to have that finalized, and we could adjust our 1200Z accordingly. So I'm just going to go through quickly kind of how the assignment procedures differ this time, because we have issued a permit sooner than the 5-year term. So everyone that is an existing permit holder got a letter that basically said you'll continue to operate under the 2018 permit until July 1st, when the new permit is effective. And this is basically just a little bit of the letter. So hopefully everyone received that, and that is your formal coverage letter that says you are covered under the new iteration of the permit, which goes from July 1, 2021 to June 30, 2026. You will not receive the first page of the permit that you're used to with your specific facility information on it. There was no renewal application required, again, because the current permit didn't expire. So therefore, the federal rules that require a renewal application are based on prior to expiration. So because we issued early, there was no renewal application, and you will not receive a formal first page of the letter saying that you're covered under the permit. I will pause here, Blair, before I go into the assignment letters, which we will still be identifying all the monitoring requirements specific to each existing facility.
All right, Sarah asks, how do we update our facility contact information since there is no renewal application?
Good question, Sarah. Of course, everyone's question is a good question. But in the letters that everyone received shortly after the permit was adopted by the Environmental Quality Commission, there was my email and my cell phone number. And I have been getting emails and calls from facilities saying that the contact information was incorrect. So we did update when I got those, I updated them all in our database. We are using the same database, obviously, to do a mailing for the monitoring assignment to identify what your monitoring will be for the next 5 years. And hopefully those of you that have asked me to change the database, hopefully those will be corrected. You can contact either your local regional office or your agent. You should certainly contact, if you're in an agent's jurisdiction, you could contact your agent, but even the agent's facilities information is held within our database. So just contact me either by email or phone and I will get that changed. I can't guarantee that the next mailing will have the correct information, but every mailing from here on out should. And we're actually moving to electronic reporting, so everything will change once that happens.
And Tabitha would like to know if the new permit requires an updated stormwater control plan that can be done by someone from our company. Can they make those updates, or do they need to be done by an engineer?
Anyone can update your stormwater pollution control plan. And yes, every existing facility must update your plan to include the new provisions in the permit. We will go through that in a little more detail later.
A couple more questions before we move on. Anonymous would like to know if that they lease property at the Salem airport and fall under the City of Salem's 12Z permit. Is there a list of responsibilities available for lessees?
There's a little information in the permit. If you search for the word tenant, there's some specifics around specific to these type of facilities, airports or large industrial parks. It is the responsibility of the permit holder to ensure they are compliant with the permit conditions. So you would just coordinate with them and ensure that you're controlling industrial stormwater and any materials that you have on site.
And Johnny Levy would like to know, he's curious to know that if flows through an industrial site are rerouted around the facility through adjoining an industry-owned property, but they do not come into contact with industrial activities, is a 12Z still required? And I can repeat that, or I don't know if you have access to that, Krista.
I see it, and no, you don't need to repeat it. The industrial stormwater permit is, again, for stormwater that comes into contact with industrial activity that discharges into any surface waters in Oregon. So if there is no industrial activity coming in contact with the stormwater leaving your site, you do not need an industrial stormwater permit. There are, if you do have the applicable SIC codes, so the standard industrial classification code, like I talked about, those 29 larger sectors, and those again are listed in Schedule E of our permit from federal, coming down from federal regulations. Starting at page 46. So if you do have one of those industrial standard codes and your stormwater, there is a provision called no exposure certification that allows you to certify every 5 years that your industrial site that has an industrial code that's eligible for the 1200Z has no industrial stormwater exposure to materials or contaminants And then you fill out the no exposure certification every 5 years that certifies that your site doesn't need an industrial permit and that you're certifying that there is no industrial exposure. So that's what would be required if you do have a standard industrial code as required under the 1200C.
So we have, it's not really a question, it's a statement that the map does not seem to be working right. It does not list the impairments in the waterways from the legend. And I guess I could say that obviously DEQ will correct any broken links, but would you like to add anything to that, Krista, about the impairment or impaired waterway map?
Sure. Yeah, I spent about a month determining impairments, and on this slide you can see the arrow there for the new assessment unit ID. This is a new identifier, a new code of your receiving stream based on the new methodology and changes that went into the 2018-2020 integrated report, which outlines the impaired waters in Oregon. And so we know that the maps are not working completely well, and we are working on it. We just updated our memory, and our IT team is working really hard to get those to function better.
Great, and a couple more just came in and we'll answer these. And I think we have about 10 that are with tier 2 triggers or benchmarks or certain pollutant parameters, so we can hold off on those. But Anonymous would like to know, when will assignment letters be issued?
Those should be going out very shortly for DEQ sites. Most of them have been drafted, and it varies on which region you're in. All the agent sites, I believe, have already sent all their letters, but you should get them very soon.
Okay, and Anonymous again, when should we expect to receive our permit letter with monitoring requirements? If we do not receive it by a certain date, how can we get another copy?
How can we get another copy?
Correct.
So again, hopefully most of the existing facility folks know maybe the regional person. You can always contact me. However, I will be gone most of June, so your letters should be being mailed out. There is a way to contact the regional facilities from our industrial webpage. There's contacts on the right-hand side, so you can use that if you don't know your regional contact. But certainly contacting your regional staff is the best way.
Right. We answered quite a few, so we can move on if you'd like, and then answer the rest at the relevant time.
Great. Thanks so much, Blair. So as we did in the last couple iterations of the permit, ever since we've required impairment monitoring, we will be sending you, each of you, the tables of your required monitoring. This is what they will look like. And because we've expanded the georegions, again, that's another granularity that we will, certainly help you identify which georegion you're in. There are some nuance to the permit that are a little different than what we had last time, and that is If you do have impaired waters, if you do discharge into a 303D impaired receiving water for copper, lead, zinc, or pH, because those also are statewide benchmarks, you will only be assigned impairment concentrations and impairment monitoring for any of those pollutants. So in the past, we have assigned statewide benchmarks, sector-specific benchmarks, and impairment monitoring for the same parameters, and we will not be doing that this time around. So again, if you have an impairment for those pollutants, those 4 pollutants, you will not also be sampling on a statewide benchmark. You will follow kind of the corrective action for any exceedance under the impairments in the permit, which we'll go through in depth later. But I just want to point out that very important fact. And excuse me, you can read the specifics of that in Schedule B6, I believe, in the permit that talks about pollutant parameters. That section, Schedule B6, kind of outlines when you'll get a kind of the hierarchy of when you'll get assigned certain benchmark or impairment monitoring if it's the same pollutant. So again, for the sector specific, if you have been identified under the sector requirements to have a benchmark that's the same as your statewide benchmark, you will just be sampling under the statewide benchmark. And then under the impairment tables, we are now identifying again that assessment unit ID, which we'll go through later as well. But when you have kind of an idea and figure out how to use the maps or the new assessment database, which is the database that outlines the category 5 pollutants based on our EPA approved 2018-2020 integrated report. Again, the integrated report is the way that we outline the impaired waters and their status throughout the state. So you will have on your letters and in your monitoring tables a 6-digit AU ID, assessment unit ID, and that 6-digit, which the assessment unit IDs are much longer than that, but the 6-digit is how you can search the database, the assessment database, and how you can search the maps. And hopefully that will help you determine, your impairments. You can double check on those. We did our best with the tools available to us to accurately identify impairments based on your receiving stream. For those of you that have more than one receiving stream or sector-specific co-located industrial classification codes, so more than one SIC code, these monitoring tables won't identify more than one receiving stream or more than one standard industrial code. But we do talk about the co-located industrial codes if you've identified those for us, but we won't break out the co-located monitoring per monitoring location. So that's what the tables don't do. So there is more information needed, and we will get those letters out soon, and hopefully you'll have around a month to identify any discrepancies that might be in the letter and and the letters will give you your regional contact, and you can contact those people and we can revise any of the monitoring tables that we need to, but hopefully most of them will be accurate. I'll pause there. Blair, do you have any questions on monitoring assignments?
We do, and specific to impaired water bodies. So Jason would like to know, please verify that only Category 5 303D listed parameters for a water body trigger impairment monitoring. For example, if copper is a Cat 4 for a water body, then no impairment monitoring, correct?
Correct.
Great. And there was another one, actually our first question. Somebody was prophetic in asking this quite a while ago. Does a letter outlining monitoring requirements inform as to whether discharge is to a 303D listed water body for an impairment parameter?
Yes. So again, it will be that third table down there. It will list your receiving water, your LLID, which is just a different identifier, your AUID, which is the consistent identifier for the effective assessment database and map. So you'll use that 6-digit instead of your LLID to search the map in the assessment database. And again, the receiving water is based on your facility's location and the nearest receiving water. So if you commingle and you discharge through a MS4, you know, there could be some errors in your receiving water. So it's important that you really look at these tables and verify that they are accurate when you get them. And like I said, hopefully you'll have them at least by June or so. So you'll have, you know, at least a few weeks before the permit is effective to identify and remedy any discrepancies.
And one more, Krista, specific to this topic by Anonymous. So if a facility is impaired for copper, a Tier 1 report would not be required for one exceedance, as it would be if it were a statewide benchmark. Is that correct?
That's correct. No more Tier 1 for impairment exceedance.
Great.
Tier 1s do apply to statewide and sector-specific benchmark exceedances.
Here's another one from somebody's Galaxy phone. Also, have the amount of impairment monitoring concentration pollutants been reduced from sampling?
Yes, and we'll go into that in depth later.
Okay. So I think that is it for this particular topic. We can move on.
Great. So let's move on from kind of this assignment procedural stuff into where we are today. So existing facilities are currently operating under the permit that was reissued based on those short-term settlement agreements in October 22nd, 2018, and will begin to be regulated under the reissued permit on July 1, 2021. So this expiration date of July 31, 2022 doesn't have any relevance anymore. Again, that was the 5-year term expiration based on the effective date, August 1, 2027, 2017, and a lot has happened since then, and we have reissued the current permit a year early, so the existing permit will cease to, you will cease to be regulated under that starting July 1, 2021. So moving into the specifics of the new permit. We're going to go through the different kinds of monitoring and what's changed. And I will again pause after each of the slides, or every couple slides, to make sure we're addressing any applicable questions. So the statewide benchmarks, we expanded the georegions. In the 2018 permit, there was the Columbia River georegion, the Columbia Slough georegion, and the Portland Harbor georegion, and the rest of the state. We've expanded those to be in line with our water quality standards that has basically determined georegions, which is which are developed from, again, EPA's ecoregions. So these are based on geography and topographic and ecosystems and all sorts of determinations to assess the 5 main georegions throughout the state of Oregon. So we in the 1200Z have 7 georegions because the Columbia Slough has a TMDL for industrial stormwater, and the Portland Harbor is under a Superfund site based on contamination. So that's why our permit has expanded to 7 georegions. We decided to ensure that the 7 georegions were used this permit cycle because of, you can see in the benchmarks, if you have those open, there's a lot of differences when we do the modeling based on the ambient, the actual water quality in the georegions. So that's how we do the benchmark work. We look at the monitoring stations and all the water quality data that is available to us. And we run those through models, and we develop different benchmarks based on the different water quality throughout those georegions. So since we are expanding to have water quality impairment, possibly water quality based effluent limits based on water quality and the impairment concentrations, we wanted to make sure that the concentrations were applicable to these georegions. So that was one reason why we kind of expanded into the 7 georegions, to make sure that the concentrations were as accurate as possible. We removed oil and grease from the statewide benchmarks. We recalculated the metals, including creating a marine waters georegions. So that actually made 8 georegions. And we developed regional translators. These are done by using the dissolved to total ambient, again, water quality data in the receiving streams, and comparing those, and then coming up with a translator that is more representative of the receiving stream and the aquatic life in it. So basically, when you compare dissolved to total, you can translate from water quality to a benchmark by using these regional translators that are still protective of the aquatic life, and develop a translator that is that shows how the dissolved fraction of the discharge will impact the water quality. So it's a little complicated, and I certainly am able to go into any details on that if you would like, but we did that evaluation. So again, the monitoring table for the statewide benchmarks indicates which areas and which pollutant we calculated we used the calculation for a regional translator. Backing up, I will state why a translator is needed. Federal regulations require our permit monitoring to be in total, and our water quality standards is in dissolved. So again, when we model, the modeled values that come out for the benchmarks are in dissolved, and EPA has created or has developed translators to help permitting authorities to translate from that dissolved either in a water quality or your modeled output into total, which are required to be sampled for in an MPDES permit. So you need that translator. The EPA translators have been used in the past, and they are certainly fairly conservative. They're almost 1-to-1. So therefore, we have where the paired data was robust enough and we had enough data, we did evaluate regional translators and use those when we were calculating from dissolved to total to create the benchmarks in those areas. We also moved E. coli for the treatment works and the landfill sectors. Those benchmarks, we moved those into Sector E. So those are no longer statewide benchmarks for those two industrial sectors. There are some chats. Are you seeing those, Blair? Those anything we need to address?
A couple of questions in the Q&A that are pertinent to this. So Kelly would like to know, does this mean that the Portland Harbor georegion is remaining the same area as before?
That's correct.
Okay.
The boundaries for the Portland Harbor, the Columbia Slough, and the Columbia River georegions have not changed.
And since you mentioned E. coli, here's a question about E. coli from Lance. If a water body like Yaquina Bay, did I say that right, is listed for E. coli and you require testing, but the site can show that it is a natural issue, such as gulls defecating on the surface, what do you require to get a waiver?
Will you repeat that, please?
If a water body is listed for E. coli and you require testing, but the site can show that it is a natural issue, such as gulls defecating on the surface, what does DEQ or what do you require to get a waiver?
So that's, we're talking about statewide benchmarks right now. We'll go into great depth of impairment monitoring, but I will address that question right now. And for impairment monitoring, we did a rulemaking, water quality rulemaking in 2011 for bacteria. So our bacteria standard does include wildlife. So regardless if it is, if the contaminant of E. coli is discharging from some industrial activity operation or from birds on your site, those are regulated the same under our water quality standards to protect our receiving waters. So the waiver condition would be based on your sample results meeting that 406 organisms per 100 milliliters. And it would be based on the monitoring waiver condition for impairment monitoring.
And another question for this slide, has oil and grease been removed to be sampled in the new permit? Our facility does not have to sample for this compared to the current permit.
That's correct. No more sampling of oil and grease under a statewide benchmark.
Great. I think there's one more question, or a couple that maybe were answered earlier, so we should answer those now again. So what is the next permit expiration date, if not 2022?
So the current permit will no longer be the permit existing facilities are registered under starting July 1, 2021. So that expiration date of 2022 no longer has any relevance because we have reissued the permit early. The permit that will be in effect in July 1 of 2021, all existing facilities will become regulated under that on that date. You don't have to do anything. You will continue to be have industrial stormwater permitting regulation or coverage. You will continue to have coverage, and the existing permit expires June 30, 2026, another 5-year term. We've never had to cut a permit term short. This is the first time, so we're working through this the best we can. And again, the reason we cut it short was due to the lawsuit and the consent decree filed in Multnomah Court requiring DEQ to issue early.
And another question from Anonymous having to do with the permit being issued early. Would we be able to waiver out based on prior year's numbers because of this permit being changed early?
No, and I have some slides on monitoring waivers coming up, but
Great.
All monitoring waivers will be revoked, and the federal regulations that we implement as a delegated state require that every permit cycle monitoring must begin until you're eligible for a waiver under that reissued permit.
And that should cover this portion of the presentation, so you can move on, Krista.
Great, thanks, Blair. Thanks for all the thoughtful questions. So here's the statewide benchmarks. Again, the 2 footnote there is, well, the 2 superscript, I think, is a footnote in the current permit that I didn't include, but that shows you when there was a regional translator used. And then for the Columbia Slough, E. coli has a statewide benchmark monitoring requirement. And that footnote 1 refers to an error we identified in the integrated report for the Columbia Slough assessment units. So basically, the Columbia Slough is broken up into 2 assessment units, and one had no E. coli impairment for category 5, 303 on the 303D list, no impairment for E. coli. The other assessment unit did have E. coli identified as a 303D listed parameter. However, that was an error. So since that was identified prior to the permit being issued, we were able to catch that and denote it in the actual permit that Columbia Slough dischargers will only be sampling for E. coli as a statewide benchmark and will not be assigned any impairment monitoring for E. coli. So now I'll kind of go through this tiered system here of what happens if you have a statewide benchmark exceedance. So again, talking about if your sample results come in over your benchmark. So the statewide benchmarks include copper, lead, zinc, pH, and total suspended solids. And then the Columbia Slough have the additional benchmarks of biological oxygen demand, phosphorus, and E. coli based on the total daily maximum load, or the TMDL. So your exceedance response for a statewide benchmark is a tier 1, or I guess not or, sorry, and the industrial specific checklist. So these industrial specific checklists are mentioned in the permit. They are not on the website yet. We are still working on them. And they are similar to the draft permits Appendix B I talked about earlier, and EPA's Appendix Q that was in their draft permit but was not finalized. So EPA did a lot of work to identify certain source and operational controls specific to each sector. We wanted to, use that or build on that as a technical assistance tool for facilities that trigger tier 1. So we're still working on it, and it will get up on the website hopefully prior to anyone sampling and receiving monitoring results and needing to do a tier 1 corrective action. So what that's going to look like is, still a checklist. It's in a checklist format, and it will have universal source control and operational control BMPs. So things you can look at to help a facility that in doing their tier 1 investigation. Any of you that looked at Appendix B, it was 630 some pages, I think. It was over 600 pages based on EPA's checklists. So, and a lot of those were repeat throughout the sectors. So what we've done is we've made one universal checklist for all sectors. So it is a facility's choice if they would like to use the checklist that will be made available to help them maybe determine some BMPs to reduce their pollutant loading and get the next sample of industrial stormwater under the benchmarks. And then in addition, you will do the universal and you will do the sector specific that is applicable to your standard industrial classification code. So that's what this industrial checklist is. It's just, we didn't want to just trash the whole idea of having a additional technical assistance document to help people identify pollutant sources. So we're continuing with that, but it is an optional checklist. So a tier 1 report will be required and the checklist is optional. Continue to monitor at least for 1 full year, which is July 1 through June 30, until eligible for a waiver. And then each year you need to evaluate your tier 2 geometric mean based on the previous year's samples. So in the current permit, you do it 1 time per permit cycle during the 2nd year of coverage. In the permit that becomes effective July 1, 2021, the next iteration of the permit, the tier 2 evaluation is required for each discharge point based on each full monitoring year's data every year. So each August 15th, you will report your geometric mean based on your sample results, and you will reevaluate your geometric mean annually unless you trigger tier 2. So if you trigger tier 2, then you no longer need to report the geometric mean, nor do you continue to have to do any tier 1s or do any additional controls above your tier 2 corrective action. And any tier 2 corrective action needs to be installed something appropriate at all your substantially similar discharge points. So if you're exempt from monitoring based on your discharge points being substantially similar, you need to address your tier 2 corrective action for those non-monitored discharge points that are associated with the monitoring point that triggered tier 2. I will pause again because that's a lot of information.
Yes, and a lot of questions are coming in based on that. The first one from Johnny, speaking of waivers, why was the eligibility requirement for a monitoring waiver increased from 4 consecutive samples to 5? How does this increase in monitoring improve receiving water quality?
Well, again, we looked at a lot of reports. We looked at EPA's permit. There was a lot that went into the decisions that were finalized in the next iteration of the permit. The National Academies of Sciences report recommended that 4 sample results are not appropriate to grant a waiver. EPA's permit also increased the amount of samples needed in order to discontinue monitoring. And a geometric mean, really the appropriate amount of samples to evaluate a geometric mean are 5. So those are some reasons why we increased it to 5 samples. Again, there's more information later specific to monitoring waivers, and we are requiring every facility to reinstate monitoring the last year. And depending on your facility's discharge, it could impact water quality, correct?
Okay. And Jessica would like to know, do you need to monitor at substantially similar points after putting in the tier 2 treatment?
Yes.
Okay. Sarah would like to know, can you clarify, and I think she's talking about the previous slide with the table. This table indicates total zinc at 1400 of a milligram per liter, but the draft permit indicates 12. And that's for the Willamette Valley. I don't know if there's a discrepancy there or.
So the change for the Willamette Valley zinc was based on the regional translator being used to calculate from the modeled dissolved values to the total benchmark.
Bruce would like to know, so any waiver based on substantial similarity expires now, and then what is needed to reestablish substantial similarity?
Your substantially similar determination that's been approved on your site based on your stormwater pollution control plan, and that being reviewed by DEQ or your agent, does not expire now. You will continue to work off of, you will continue to only have to monitor your monitoring points based on any substantially similar determination that's been approved based on your plan going forward. If you're in tier 2 now, the current permit requires you to address your substantially similar discharge points if you've triggered tier 2 in the current permit cycle, or previously you were to put appropriate treatment on all those discharge points, and therefore you would be sampling those if you had triggered tier 2 and you've already installed, and you need to you can discontinue sampling if that is the case once you meet the monitoring conditions. So once a facility has triggered tier 2 for your substantially similar determination is revoked, basically, and you have to install treatment, because the substantially similar determination is based on monitoring your discharge at one location and exempting the rest of those discharges because the site has similar BMPs and similar industrial materials, and the determination is based on that similar effluent, the similar discharge for those discharge points being similar to the monitored. So under that rationale, if you trigger tier 2 for the monitored point, the substantially similar discharge points also need to have tier 2 addressed, and monitoring has to resume. And then those substantially similar discharge points become monitoring points and are eligible to be discontinued, to be sampled based on the waiver condition, but no longer are eligible to be discontinued to be sampled based on the substantially similar discharge condition. That was a lot. Let me know if you have a follow-up, Bruce.
There are quite a few questions about waiver eligibility and conditions, so I think you can refine that a little more by answering these. Anonymous would like to know, my company has had a waiver accepted every year since participation starting 2012 and 13. That should create enough history to justify a continuous waiver. That's a question.
Again, we're required as a delegated authority to reinstate monitoring the first year of a reissued permit.
Great. Danielle asks, can we submit our 5 samples in 1 year to trigger the waiver as long as we have the 14 days in between the samples, or do we have to wait until the 2nd year to submit that 5th sample?
You can sample 5 times within the first full monitoring year, which is July 1 through June 30. As long as you make 14 days. And again, well, so that means you can't get it in the first 6 months. You can't sample 5 times in the first 6 months. You have to wait till the January 1 to June 30, 6 months to get your additional samples, and then you can be eligible for a waiver, yes.
Couple more questions on waivers, just to clarify. Waiver eligibility over consecutive years doesn't create a history of being below benchmarks?
It probably does, and it certainly shows that you are meeting the waiver condition. The waiver criteria has changed, and because we're reissuing the permit, you need to establish that baseline again.
Did the requirements change from waiting 14 days to 72 hours between sample events?
The draft had 72 hours. It did not get finalized in the permit that was adopted by the EQC. The permit currently and the permit for the next 5 years, starting July 1, 2021, has 14 days in between samples.
Thanks. And the last one I see on monitoring from Anonymous, can you collect 5 samples in the same monitoring year to qualify for a waiver during that year?
Yes, again, you cannot collect 5 samples in the first 6 months. You can collect, 2 or 3, but you need to wait till the second 6 months to get to apply for a waiver. And we do talk about waivers later. Okay. I'm happy to read.
I'll hold off on those then. Here's some more general question. What is the difference between georegion and receiving water?
Receiving water is the stream that your industrial stormwater discharges into. So depending on your facility location, it's generally the nearest stream to your site. Just depends on your conveyance, or if you are on a waterway or your stormwater enters into a pipe system through the municipal system. But your receiving stream is the water body that actually takes your industrial stormwater discharge, where it enters into the stream. Your industrial stormwater enters into the stream. A georegion is the larger geographic areas that DEQ uses for water quality standards, and we use in this permit to distinguish like areas where we break the state up into larger areas that are the same type of ecosystem.
And Johnny asks, what is the purpose of reestablishing baseline after permit reissuance if industrial activities have not changed substantially?
Again, we have no leeway to change federal rule. As delegated NPDES permit regulating authority, we must follow federal regulations and federal rules. Federal rules require each 5 years, facilities must reinstate monitoring.
So there are quite a few questions about tier 2 requirements. Are you going to expand on that or talk more about that, Krista, or would you like to hear those questions now?
We do go into corrective action a little later.
Okay.
This is simply, you know, kind of the overview of what happens if you exceed a statewide benchmark.
Okay. Then we can ask a couple of those now. Gwen wants to know, what if they triggered a tier 2 this past year under the old permit and now higher marine water benchmarks have negated exceedances? What do we design mass reduction to?
It depends when you triggered tier 2. So if you are still developing your tier 2 corrective action and you're a Pacific Ocean discharger, those are the facilities that will be assigned a marine waters georegion. You may adjust your tier 2 plan.
Okay. And I think this goes right in line with that. If a facility has tier 2 exceedances in previous permit terms, how does that affect monitoring and corrective action requirements for this new permit term?
All facilities must implement and adhere to any deadlines or tier 2 corrective action that was triggered in the 2018 permit. Those don't really change. If you are one of the facilities that was required to submit a plan or implement or is still implementing a tier 2 corrective action and have yet to put things in the ground and your benchmarks have changed, you can talk to your regional staff and you are able to adjust your tier 2 corrective action to those benchmarks.
I think
but the deadlines and the tier 2 corrective action that was triggered in the current permit, those don't change.
great. We have quite a few questions that were answered by that. Are you going to clarify which parameters are benchmarks and which are numeric limits?
So these are your statewide benchmarks. Again, your monitoring tables that each facility will receive will outline if you have an impairment for the same parameters where you have a statewide benchmark, you will be assigned impairment monitoring only. You will not be assigned a statewide benchmark. So your exceedance response will follow Schedule A 13 under the permit, the exceedance based on impairment monitoring.
And one last question before we move on. It appears that if we exceed certain parameters, such as pH, copper, lead, or zinc, and discharge to a Cat 5303D water, this would escalate to a reduced limit. Is this correct?
It could, and I will go in depth in that, yes.
Okay. Great. I think that's all I have for you now, Krista.
Thanks, Blair. All right, so let's go over the sector-specific benchmarks real quick. Again, we recalculated all of the sector-specific benchmarks based on Oregon's water quality standards. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we adopt that Schedule E, the sector-specific requirements from EPA. Therefore, previously, we've never analyzed the benchmark concentrations because they were based on federal water quality standards. So we've never analyzed if our Oregon's water quality standards are different than the federal water quality standards. And we did that this time. So a lot of the benchmarks changed based on that body of work. So now, our water quality standards are our foundation for protecting our water quality. And now all the benchmarks listed in Schedule E are in line and derived from Oregon's water quality standards instead of the federal water quality standards. As I mentioned earlier, E. coli was moved to Sector E, Schedule E, for the treatment works and landfills out of the statewide benchmarks. We have included saltwater benchmarks in Schedule E, and no additional benchmarks were added based on the EPA permit discontinuing to finalize the additional benchmarks for Sector O, P, and R. So a sector-specific benchmark exceedance. So again, many of the concentrations have been revised. All the metals have been calculated based on the mean of hardness of the georegion. So when we model the benchmarks, one of the outputs is the hardness for that georegion area, and we use that calculation, which is needed in order to calculate. You need the hardness in order to calculate based on our water quality standards. You need hardness in order to calculate the metals. So those were done, and that is that's at the beginning of Schedule E in Table 10. Those metals, we haven't done that in the past. Again, you won't be assigned a sector-specific benchmark for the same pollutant that has a statewide benchmark. And if you exceed, it's a Tier 1 report, a Tier 1 corrective action response. And again, the industrial checklist is optional to you. And then you continue to monitor at a minimum 1 full year until eligible for a waiver. So let's get into impairment monitoring. There was a lot of changes here, and hopefully we can clear some things up. So again, impairment monitoring is only applicable to discharges into Category 5 303T listed waters. So Category 5 is just another way of saying 303D list. The 303D list is the list of impaired waters for a parameter that has yet to develop a TMDL. We narrowed the pollutant list to 6 pollutants: copper, lead, zinc, pH, E. coli, and iron. And that was based on a substantial amount of work done by our contractor, PG Environmental. PG Environmental was hired to help us in the rulemaking with a lot of technical expertise and work. I mean, they really performed a lot of technical work for us. So one of the technical scopes that they performed for us was to evaluate all the monitoring data from 2000 to 2018, and to see, based on a 10% threshold, what parameters were the industrial stormwater discharge exceeding. And that's how we narrowed the pollutant list for impairment monitoring. Those pollutants showed that we were exceeding 10% or more. So we recalculated the impairment concentrations, again, using the median hardness. I think the last slide was incorrect, so we used median, not mean. Those are slightly different. And again, if you exceed, going forward after July 1, 2021, if you exceed sampling for an impairment pollutant, you no longer have to perform a tier 1, because we have a whole new framework for exceedance based on triggering and escalating to a water quality based effluent limit. Again, all this work was done based on the new 2018-2020 integrated report and the new 303D list. That very large effort of evaluating and redoing the 303D list and all the impaired water designations throughout the state, they went through a huge methodology change, and that resulted in a lot of delistings for the metals that industrial stormwater have sampled for in the past, and just a whole new way of looking at how we assess impaired waters. And so that was a huge effort that kind of went on while we were doing the effort of renewing the permit. So I'll pause there for any questions.
Yes, Jean would like a clarification. Your response earlier was to exceedances of a tier 2 on the current permit term, and what he wants to know if there are currently installed tier 2 measures in place from a previous permit, can they be removed or bypassed if the facility feels it can meet the new applicable limits?
Because a lot of the benchmarks went up due to using regional translators, a lot of these questions of what we do with the treatment we have on site need to be addressed between you and your agent or your regional staff. Tier 2 corrective action becomes part of your stormwater pollution control plan and is enforceable. We will need to evaluate each of those type of situations between, you'll need to evaluate that with your regional staff or your agent. I just can't answer that on a broader scale.
And someone from Mal Foster, is the tier 2 checklist required for all infiltration facilities not installed as part of the tier 2 action, or is that evaluation optional to avoid having to sample overflows?
Let me read this one for myself. Just a minute, please.
It's pretty much right in the middle of the Q&A.
Mm-hmm. So let's hold that question until we get to the new condition, which is Schedule A6, which is the mass reduction measures certification. And let's talk about that then, Blair.
Okay. I would think the next, or the top 3 questions would fall under the same category, so we can hold off on those as well. So we're probably good to move on, Krista.
Thanks again. All right, so again, we've narrowed the list, and there's a new framework in the permit for exceedances. Based on 2 consecutive exceedances, your facility, based on that discharge point that discharges into a 303D receiving stream, will escalate to a numeric water quality based effluent limit for copper, lead, zinc, and pH, or a narrative water quality based effluent limit for 2 consecutive exceedances of iron and E. coli. So we go into more detail on this. This is the big change that I'm sure folks that discharge to a Category 5 water have a lot of questions about. Again, a lot of the listings and a lot of the pollutants that you may discharge now may have changed based on the 2018-2020 integrated report. And the rationale for this is unimpaired water on the 303D list has no capacity to take more pollutant that it's impaired for. So if it's impaired for copper, it's already degraded to the extent of having too much copper already in that water body. So as a regulated entity, you must not be allowed to add more of that pollutant into an already impaired water that has no more assimilating capacity for that pollutant. So just some more schematics and some more information on how this will work. So you'll be identified in your you'll be notified in your monitoring table identification that you discharge to a 303D listed water body. You'll be given the assessment unit ID, so you'll be able to put that into the assessment database or into the map. You'll be able to see what receiving water we say you discharge to. If any of these seem inaccurate to you, please contact us so that we can look at it again for you. So once you've been identified that your receiving stream is a Category 5 receiving stream, and you have a 2 consecutive sample exceedances, then your concentration will, or your type of monitoring will change from an impairment monitoring to a limit. You will have up to 2 years to adjust your site as needed. So a 2-year compliance schedule is available to you to make changes. And again, this is a new framework for copper, lead, zinc, and pH. I'm gonna do one more slide and then I will actually probably, it's already 11. I want to take just a 5-minute break for the webinar. So I'm going to do one more slide. We'll answer a couple of questions and we'll take a 5-minute break. So this is a shift too. So I mentioned earlier about us going through rulemaking for our water quality standards for our bacteria indicators. So in conjunction with the changes in the methodology and the integrated report that should have accurately used the maps and the bacteria indicators from the rulemaking to assess the correct bacterial impairment. We are asking that facilities mostly on the coast and in the bays that have fecal, coliform, and enterococcus sampling, we're asking that you sample that bacterial indicator. There is no concentration for that. You sample 4 times a year and report on the DMR. Because there's no concentration that you're eligible for a waiver for, you will likely sample for the 5-year term unless you have non-detects, because the waiver eligibility for impairment will allow you to discontinue monitoring for fecal coliform and enterococcus if you have 2 years of non-detects. We currently use E. coli as a surrogate. We're discontinuing that practice because it's not really an appropriate surrogate for the other bacterial indicators. And when you're sampling these, depending on your sample results, you could be required to have a narrative water quality base limit similar to or the same as E. coli in the permit. If we identify that your discharge is causing a health impact. So because fecal coliform and enterococcus are related to shellfish harvesting and public recreation, swimming, we will look at those as we need to for those facilities that discharge to a 303D listed receiving water that's impaired for those in bacterial indicators. But what we're really trying to do is get data for the correct bacterial indicator for the correct impairments based on these bacteria. I am going to go one more actually. So here's the list of the concentrations. This is the concentrations you will monitor for based on your georegion. And the concentration for your limit will be the same as for your impairment monitoring if you trigger a numeric limit. And I will pause there. And then we'll go through kind of the exceedance response, and we will go through in depth about the compliance schedule and what that means for facilities.
Do you want to take a couple questions, Krista, before we pause?
Sure.
Okay. Can 2 consecutive exceedances of a statewide benchmark lead to a numeric limit?
No, again, if your industrial stormwater discharges into a 303 delisted stream, you will not be assigned a statewide benchmark for the same parameters.
And Lance, oops, sorry.
You will only be responding to an impairment exceedance, as this slide indicates.
Lance would like to know, will there be an alternative that does not require the sample for E. coli to be delivered to a lab within a short time window?
No, again, we have no flexibility on our sample, you know, on the sample holding times, those are all, we require those to be compliant with 40 CFR 136, which is the federal requirement that outlines all those holding times and preservation and bottle criteria.
Okay, they keep coming in about the impairment sampling. So Jessica has another one. If impairment sampling is for iron and not one of the pollutants you mentioned, will 2 consecutive exceedances trigger a limit and implement the 2-year compliance schedule?
Iron and E. coli are the narrative water quality based effluent limit kind of pathway, and we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay. So last one should be good for now. Can you explain the difference between numeric water quality based effluent limits, Schedule B3, 4, and 5, and the numeric effluent limitations based on effluent limit guidelines, Schedule B1? It seems very subtle. Hold on a second. It seems very subtle, the difference in the use of the language between limits and limitations, and also the response. That's the second question, if you want to read it, Krista. It's pretty long.
I think I got the gist. So we made a clear change in the monitoring tables that you will receive to indicate that those limits that you'll be identified if you're one of the few industries that have a technology-based effluent limit under B1 that are the concentrations in Schedule E. So if you have a limit and you've had a limit, likely, I mean, those haven't changed. So if you've been subject to a limit previously, those are technology-based effluent limits that are derived from a very long process that EPA has adopted. So those are called effluent limitation guidelines. That's just the term they use. But it's a multi-year process. And again, we have a lot of information on that if you want to dig into the rulemaking record. When we talk about technology limits in Oregon, which we did not end up going with for this permit cycle, just due to the amount of work it takes and the data you need to develop a technology-based effluent limit. So basically that means EPA thinks that those sectors can meet that discharge concentration based on the available technologies that are out there to control your industrial stormwater. That's what a technology limit is basically saying. Like, here's your concentration. It's up to you to use whatever source control, advanced treatment, passive treatment. We know that you can get to this concentration based on the available technologies that we've identified, and it's up to you to meet this limit. So we've tried to distinguish that in the permit and in the identification of the monitoring tables. So if you had a limit before, you still have a limit. That's a technology-based limit. What the permit now includes is water quality-based effluent limits. Those are based on, again, your discharge to impaired water, a 303 delisted water, that says it's up to you to control your discharge to meet a concentration that protects that already impaired water. that's kind of the difference. We added water quality-based effluent limits, and EPA develops and has technology-based effluent limits already, and those are based on certain industrial sectors.
So I think we can answer the rest of these after our break, Krista.
All right, let's see, what do we got? 11:06, let's come back at 11:10. Thank you, everyone. I can't believe it's 11:10. All right, everyone, we got to start moving. We're going to end this by noon. I don't mind going a little longer if people want to stay on, but anyway, so here we go. So the impairment exceedance, again, you won't be assigned a benchmark if you have an impairment concentration. Again, they only are applicable to 303 delisted receiving streams. And a numeric water quality limit is only applicable to zinc, copper, lead, and pH. They're at the concentrations in table 5 specific to your georegion. You exceed once or non-consecutive, no tier 1, and no formal corrective action to us, but it would behoove you to do what you can to get your concentrations down to avoid a limit. Continue to monitor unless eligible for a waiver. And then if you trigger a water quality-based effluent limit, you need to request a compliance schedule if that is something that you need in order to adjust your site to reduce your concentrations to meet the limit. And you continue to monitor, and you are not eligible for a waiver once you've triggered a once your impairment monitoring is triggered the 2 consecutive and has triggered a numeric limit. And monitoring waivers are not applicable or eligible for limit. So once you've triggered, you are ineligible for a waiver. So the compliance schedule, I'm going to go through a couple of slides, then I will pause again on the compliance schedule. So the compliance schedule is available to you if you have 2 consecutive sample results over the impairment concentration. You must make site changes as soon as possible to control your discharge. So there again are a lot of federal regulations based that guide and dictate what a compliance schedule is. Oregon DEQ also has an internal management directive that dictates how we implement a compliance schedule in a permit. And as a discharger into an impaired water, you need to control that discharge to the concentration as soon as possible. So that's that's your goal, is to control that discharge to the concentrations as soon as possible. If you would like a compliance schedule, you can request that, but you must request that no later than 30 days after triggering. So after getting your sample results and realizing that you've triggered with 2 consecutive exceedance over the impairment concentration. You must meet Schedule C milestones. So that's table 9. There are milestones that you must and reports you must do during the 2-year time frame. And at the end of that 2 years, that's the maximum time, you will then your monitoring will then move from an impairment concentration to a numeric water quality base limit. So again, it's the same concentration that you're striving to meet. However, numeric limit is the sampling frequency is 2 times a year instead of 4 times a year. Once it becomes a limit, you must meet it or it's a violation if you are over the concentration. And substantially similar discharge locations, again, are not eligible or not applicable or are not, you can't use them if you have a limit. So again, this is federal rule, this is federal regulations. So whatever monitoring point, if you have substantially similar determination, you must sample all those locations, all those discharge locations for the limit. No monitoring waiver is available for effluent limits, and if you continue to exceed the concentrations, we may require that you apply for an individual permit. This is the framework for iron and E. coli, which is a narrative limit. It's different than the numeric. So I'll pause there and answer questions.
Okay. So a question concerning E. coli. Gwen wants to know, what if narrative-based effluent limits are implemented and E. coli exceedances still occur from animals? Is this a violation?
We'll go into that right now.
Okay, great.
But again, animal sources of bacterial indicator, bacterial sources of animal are regulated under our water quality standards, just like human sources. They must be controlled.
There's only one more question that has to do with tier 2 or any type of pollutant specific question.
Okay.
So the first one, if you want to read along with me, Krista. For mass reduction measures that reduce the mass of pollutants at or above the design storm, but that were not installed in response to tier 2, is certification required under condition A6E or certification voluntary and necessary only if the permit registrant wishes to obtain the monitoring waiver for such mass reduction measures?
Yeah, it's required. The draft permit only required it for mass reduction waivers as required under a tier 2 corrective action. We received comments that discontinuing sampling should be available to those that installed a mass reduction infiltration device voluntarily. Therefore, if we have no information about that device and you wish to discontinue sampling, I mean, basically, the permit requires it for volunteer systems and those that triggered a mass reduction waiver based on comments. So yes, you have to get that certified. You have to ensure that it was installed correctly, that the maintenance is being performed, that it's infiltrating to the mass of a DEQ design storm, and that information needs to be certified and provided to DEQ and agents for both types of facilities. And again, we go into that a little later.
Okay. Well, there's only a few questions left and they're pretty general, so we can move on.
Great. Okay, so the impairments monitoring requirements for total iron and E. coli. And again, these 6 parameters, the industrial stormwater that has been collected by, the regulated community and reported to us, has shown high exceedances in these parameters. Because iron and E. coli, we've heard today, wildlife sometimes impact E. coli. Iron is naturally occurring. Because these pollutants can be discharging from sources outside of industrial activity and outside of the control of the facility, we have proposed that the narrative limit pathway instead of escalating to a numeric. Please remember that the water body still has more of these pollutants than it can handle. It is impaired. The aquatic life likely are being impacted. And as a permitted facility allowed to discharge pollutants into our receiving streams, it's your responsibility to decrease those pollutants to the best way you are able. This is the whole idea of the MPDS, the pollutant discharge elimination system framework. Is you have a permit to pollute, but you must do what you can to decrease your pollutants into these waterways, and especially into 303 delisted waters. Okay, so again, you'll be identified as in your monitoring assignment to be discharging the receiving stream that's on the 303D list for iron or E. coli. If you exceed 2 consecutive, you will need to do the operational and source control narrative water quality based effluent limits as required in Schedule A13. So these are mandatory BMPs and operational source control. Same concentration. Again, you continue monitoring 4 times a year. Nothing changes on your concentration that you're monitoring for, and nothing changes on your monitoring frequency. You continue to sample 4 times a year. You must complete these narrative water quality based effluent limits, these mandatory controls. You must complete them within 90 days of receiving the sample results. You continue, there are some ongoing controls that you must do annually. You must continue to do that or it's a permit violation. And again, we may require coverage under individual permit, and your monitoring after triggering these controls is eligible for a waiver if you meet the waiver condition for impaired concentrations. One note I would like to say is the completion of these controls are demonstrated to DEQ or agent by submitting a revised stormwater pollution control plan. So you have 90 days to implement and do the narrative control, the mandatory BMPs and operational controls, and then you have 30 additional days to revise your SWIP, include those in your SWIP, and submit a revised plan to DEQ or agent. That's when DEQ or agent will be able to verify that you've met this condition. Any questions?
I don't see any specifically to that, so I guess you can keep going.
Great. So these are the concentrations. You'll notice that iron is 10 times what it was or what it is in the current permit if you are required to sample for iron. We were able to use some old EPA guidance that allows us to increase the concentration. You know, those of you that know the impacts of iron, it's mostly aesthetic, and you know, even our water quality standards, it has to do a lot with the relationship with TSS and the staining of iron. So we were able to increase that to 10 milligrams per liter. So hopefully folks can get their discharge under that concentration. I was gonna say something else, but I forget, so I'll move on. Again, so the impairment response for E. coli and iron is if you exceed once or non-consecutive, no tier 1. You just, you know, want to be mindful that you need to make site adjustments in order to avoid these mandatory BMPs if you exceed 2 consecutive. You continue to monitor until you're eligible for a waiver. And then if you trigger the narrative water quality limits, you implement those operational controls and then just continue to monitor. So, you know, your monitoring doesn't change for E. coli and iron if you trigger the narrative water quality based effluent limits. So let's go more into monitoring changes. Some of the statewide benchmarks, we decreased the biological oxygen demand down to 24 milligrams per liter for those that discharge in the Columbia Slough. That was based on another scope of work that PG Environmental did for us to evaluate the loading in the slough and make sure we were within our the original load that was required under the TMDL written in 1998. So that did decrease to keep our industrial stormwater loading that has increased based on land use and more industrial facilities consistent with the TMDL. And the Columbia River pH range narrowed based on the water quality range in Appendix B. So Appendix B is the impairment concentrations or the impairment ranges for pH, which are specific to the basin-specific water quality criteria. Monitoring waivers. I know there's a lot of discontent about having to reinstate monitoring. And again, that is a federal requirement and we have no flexibility for that. So all monitoring must reinstate on July 1, 2021. The geometric mean will now be based on 5 sample results. So you may not request prior to a full year of monitoring, but that doesn't mean you have to wait till June 30 to request. So some of those previous questions were around the minimum frequency for monitoring is 4 within a year, 2 in the July 1 to December 31 semi-annual range, 2 within the January 1 to June 30 semi-annual range. So 4 benchmark samples are required, within a year. The permit does allow for you to take more than the minimum frequency. And so again, you just have to wait until you are able to get 2 or 3 or however many in the in the second half of the year. And there is a different criteria for monitoring waiver for impairment monitoring versus benchmarks, just again, based on the water quality specifics, you know, for these impaired waters, and again, based on the National Academy's recommendations and EPA's permit. We're being very consistent with our monitoring waiver condition based on those factors. We are consistent with EPA's permit. I'll pause there. Any questions?
Yes, we're getting a few, so we can answer these. Rich would like to know, what are some of the mandatory BMPs for a narrative water quality base limit for iron?
Those are all in Schedule A13. Please read them. But some of the mandatory BMPs are implementing sweeping. You know, generally iron is, like I said, it's discharge connected to soil particles. So cleaning your site more frequently, cleaning your storm drains, cleaning your catch basins, things like that.
And Lance would like to know, will DEQ accept wildlife deterrences as a BMP?
So there is language for E. coli talking about that you can do that. You have to be very careful with the other federal and state regulations under the Migratory Bird Act, and you know, I would suggest making sure you're not violating any state wildlife rules or laws.
And in response to triggering, they didn't state, but exceedances, can you please confirm whether the 2 consecutive exceedances must be at the same sampling location and not site-wide?
That's correct.
Okay, so at the same sampling location. Great. What's the relationship between Oregon water quality standards and benchmarks? For example, were the benchmarks set based on water quality standards and are more rigorous than the water quality standards?
So yes, benchmarks are based on water quality standards. Our benchmarks are calculated at a 10% exceedance threshold for each georegion with a dilution of 5. So that methodology is in the permit evaluation report under Appendix 1 or A, whatever it ended up being categorized as, and you can read the methodology there. But yes, they're very much take into account the water quality standards and the hardness of the water.
Has DEQ updated the Tier 2 checklist for the new 12Z permit? For example, the checklist still includes the discharge benchmarks for the current permit. And will the design storm capacity be further defined?
The checklist will get updated. It has not been, and we may look at that, but likely we will not change the design storm criteria. So if you have specific questions of what more defined needs to be, please send them to me.
And another question from Anonymous. Why test water from an infiltration system when it is diverting if it has not been treated? We know that numbers will be high because it has not been treated.
So again, this is the whole basis of Schedule A6, the mass reduction measure certification. You no longer need to sample that if your certification is approved and you're meeting the mass loading of the design storm. When Tier 2 first came into the permit in pretty much 2012. The permit writer at that time wanted to set up a system where you could reduce the mass of the pollutants as a Tier 2 corrective action. That's been in the permit now. This will be the third permit cycle where you may reduce the mass of the pollutants. As you point out, benchmarks are concentration based, therefore those sample results being mass based may not still meet the concentration based benchmarks, although they are infiltrating the mass of the pollutants. So the whole structure of allowing for infiltration or reducing the mass of the load into the receiving water is something that DEQ would like to continue, and is good for the environment, and is something that we continue to promote, or think's a good thing. However, the structural framework of that in the permit has been very difficult to evaluate those sample results based on mass instead of concentration. This was even though this wasn't part of the settlement terms, of course, we discussed this a lot in our advisory committee. It has been identified as an issue, and this is the solution we came up with, is this certification. Once it's approved, you can discontinue sampling. In addition, if you do sample, and again, I have slides on this in a second, but if you do sample from those facilities, those results are not used in the geometric mean calculations. So those are the improvements we think, or the change to address the mass discharge that may exceed a design storm and be sampled out of those mass reduction devices.
How about one more before you move on? In the draft, there was mention of requiring sampling that must be done in each quarter. Has that been implemented, or is sampling still required twice in each half year?
That should have been on the proposed draft language that did not get finalized. No, we didn't finalize sampling per quarter. It's still semi-annual frequency for July 1 to December 31 and to January 1 to June 30.
Great. And that's it for this section.
Great, thank you. Okay, so just a few more changes on the waiver condition. Everyone that is granted a waiver this permit cycle must reinstate monitoring the last year of the permit cycle. So July 1, 2025 through June 30, 2026. We need 4 more samples. Again, the reasoning behind this is very much based out of the Academy's report and EPA's monitoring waiver condition in their new permit. We also need to ensure that facilities are keeping up their BMPs and all their source and operational controls, and more data for us to evaluate trends and concentrations is better. The more data we have, the more we can appropriately put conditions and change the permit as needed in the future. So, you know, decreasing the impairment monitoring came from the data that, and that analyzing the data that we've received. No longer having oil and grease benchmark has was based out of evaluating the concentrations and seeing that there, you know, very few exceed the oil and grease benchmark, plus, you know, there's all sorts of complications with if that was a good indicator. So, you know, instead of that, we still have the visual observation of oil and sheen, and we feel like that's a better indicator to capture the presence of pollution from oil and grease. So your data helps us tailor the permit and hopefully make a better permit that makes more sense. So you still must monitor until you've heard from your DEQ or agent, and you must reinstate monitor as required by the permit. So again, there's some changes there, so please make sure you read the whole permit, but make sure you're tracking the monitoring waiver conditions. Electronic DMRs are coming soon, and the agents will lag behind us. Those facilities that are regulated by the agent's jurisdictions will lag behind us. So again, the way you request a monitoring waiver and how you report your data will look very different very soon. So let's go on to visual observations. There was a big change here. You must actually pull a stormwater sample to make a visual observation. Again, this gets us in line with EPA, and if you're opening a manhole and looking, you know, down into a dark space, that really doesn't show that you're evaluating the stormwater discharge. So this is required when discharging at all discharge points, and you're required to look at that in a well-lit area for the parameters that are required under the inspection, which is oil and grease, foam, floating solids. We discontinued the observations for suspended solids because there was some issues with that. You don't need to follow the sampling protocols that you do when you're actually submitting a submitting your results to the, or your samples to the lab. You just have to take a sample and view it as part of your inspections. You document this in your inspections, and there's no reduction to visual observations. So you can't waiver out of this. Okay, we're going to go on to mass reduction measure certification, this new requirement real quick, and then I'll pause for a few more questions, and hopefully we can still end by noon, but we're on slide 41, so we're getting there. So the mass reduction measure certification, again, came from a lot of discussion and a lot of feedback from facilities throughout the years for facilities that are reducing the mass loading. So if you're infiltrating at or above the DEQ design storm, and you have installed these facilities either in response to a tier 2 mass reduction waiver or otherwise in the previous permit cycle. So this recertification or certification does not apply to anybody that is installing and has triggered and will trigger tier 2 in the 2021 to 2026 permit cycle. This is only applicable to those that have installed these devices in previous permit cycles, generally 2012 and the 2018 permit cycle. You must hire a PE, a professional engineer, or a certified engineering geologist to ensure that infiltrating as designed, installed as designed, and that the maintenance has been performed. Those are required to be submitted to DEQ or agent by December 31, 2021. We will approve or deny those within 60 calendar days. And if the report requires that you complete maintenance on those facilities, you'll have till September 30, 2022 to complete any corrective action or any maintenance that the PE or CEG requires. Once the plan's approved, then you discontinue sampling till the end of the permit cycle. There is no reinstating for these mass load reduction facilities, for these mass reduction measures. You will discontinue sampling for the entire permit cycle. And again, if you are sampling and prior to the certification being approved, those sample results will not be used for any geometric mean calculations. So again, because the geometric mean calculations for waivers and for Tier 2 are based on a concentration-based benchmark, you can exclude those sample results from the calculations. I will pause there.
Okay. So we have a lot of new ones. Does a bioswale detention or retention basin / pond need to be certified if it is not specifically designed for infiltration, but some volume may infiltrate?
Not if it does not decrease the load to DEQ's design storm or your local jurisdiction's design storm. You must use your local municipality's design storm if they have one, and it's more stringent. Otherwise, it's DEQ's design storm, which is basically the 1 year, 24-hour, 1 year, 24-hour rainfall event. So anyway, we're here to help you with that determination if you need, but smaller systems do not need to be certified.
How can the permit holder address spring, summer, and fall when there are very limited days to conduct visual monitoring? Will they be penalized if they do not conduct, such as 2 rainy days during normal business hours?
So for exceptionally large facilities that have a lot of discharge locations, maybe you have been approved for substantially similar determination, you only monitor at a couple sites, but you have several discharge locations, you can request a modification for the visual observations. We have done this in the past on kind of a rotating basis where you end up having visual observations of like your entire site within a couple month period. These are required monthly inspections and when discharging. So if you've done your monthly inspection and then you have a discharge event, you don't have to repeat your monthly inspection, you just have to do your visual observation. If you are doing your monthly inspection during a discharge event, you need to be pulling a sample during that time and observing your discharge at all your discharge locations and documenting that in your inspection report. If you have more than one discharge event in a month and you choose to break that up, I mean, it seems, I think that's okay, but you're risking not meeting that monitoring condition if you don't have a discharge event later in the month.
Okay. Can a facility voluntarily submit a mass reduction waiver even if a benchmark exceedance has not been triggered?
That's a good question. So the question, I believe, is asking, can we take advantage of discontinuing monitoring in this permit cycle coming up July 1, 2021 to 26? If we would like to install something outside of tier 2 corrective action and without a certification. And that we would just have to address on a case by case. I haven't thought of that situation, so possibly. Sorry, I know those answers aren't very good, but we'll think about that.
So Bruce asks, so all waivers expire at the beginning of the last year?
Correct.
Okay. Johnny would like to know, will reinstatement of monitoring during last year be available for use during first year of renewed permit for purposes of waiver request? So
Nope.
no, okay. So
No
rollover.
all facilities need to sample the first year and the last year of the permit cycle.
Okay. If a certification required for a mass load reduction facility was installed in 2021 as part of a tier 2 waiver from the 17-18 permit cycle that is ending. Guess that, did that make sense to you? It's the last question. Is a certification required for a mass load reduction facility that was installed in 2021 as part of a tier 2 waiver from the 2017-2018 permit cycle that is ending?
Yeah. The permit requires the languages that was installed in the previous permit cycle. So it depends if it was installed in the first year of 2020, the first half of 2021, or the second half. And for those that were installed in the first half of 2021, it doesn't really make sense to certify. The intent is that we are ensuring that facilities that have been in the ground, mass reduction facilities that have devices or facilities that have been in the ground for a while, you know, we need some assurance that those are actually reducing the load as designed prior to discontinuing monitoring. So again, certainly reach out to your regional staff, and I would think that a formal request for not having someone out could be, I mean, we'll look at that, because, you know, the permit had to have some sort of time frame for this certification, but it wouldn't be reasonable for you to recertify something you just put in last month.
We have a couple more I think we should ask now, and then do you have more slides after this, Krista?
I have more.
Okay. What if a facility samples during year 1, but is in the process of completing required maintenance to their mass reduction measure before September 2022, but the sample results in year 1 trigger a tier 2? If the maintenance is completed before September 2022, would that supersede the triggering of a tier 2? That's the last question if you'd like to read it.
So tier 1 will not be evaluated until the 2022, and any sample results from that mass reduction device would not be used for the geometric mean calculation in that tier 1, or that first full monitoring year.
Okay. Regarding the monitoring requirement for visual observations of discharges that are to be in a clean, colorless container, will the SWIP have to take into account the natural or background color of stormwater through earthen ditches in order to determine sources of pollution?
I mean, the requirement is just to record your observation. You also need to perform a tier 1 corrective action if you see any of the signs of pollution that are listed in the inspection section of the permit. So if you have an earthen berm and you pull a sample and you are discharging turbid water due to your earthen berm, but you're not exceeding the TSS benchmark, you would still need to perform a tier 1 corrective action based on that sign of pollution.
Okay. Regarding monthly visual inspections, how do we determine if we are too large to feasibly inspect our entire stormwater system?
You request a modification of the frequency from your DEQ staff or agent. But that's something that you need to propose to us, how you're going to modify your visual observations based on what's reasonable.
We have a few general questions that we can take at the end. I think it's more important you get through all these slides.
All right, let's go. Where are we at? Oh my gosh, we're already at noon. I hope people can hang on, and I'm sorry we're going over. So this is the corrective action slides. Again, the slides and the recording will be on made available. So those of you that need to hop off, please feel free. And I think I have about 50 slides. So we have, less than 10 more to go. So that's about our time frame here to end this informational webinar. Sorry to go long, but corrective action response, we'll go through it fairly quickly. Again, no more second year of coverage geometric mean evaluation. That has that is no longer a requirement. Your tier 2 evaluation is required based on your statewide benchmark concentrations. So based on the sample results of your statewide benchmarks. The geometric mean calculation is required at each monitoring point, and you report that every year with your August 15th DMR. And tier 2 implementation deadline has been extended to September 30th, a year and 9 months after triggering. So we heard a lot of feedback that facilities would like to have 2 summers in order to make site conditions or improve site conditions or do construction. And so we've extended that to allow for a summer construction season, an additional summer construction season. So again, the geometric mean is required annually throughout the permit cycle. So that means if you have multiple discharge points, you could be installing tier 2 at different times throughout the permit cycle at different monitoring locations based on, or discharge points based on your triggering events. So the transportation sector, we've extended your regulated footprint from just the auxiliary operations that are in the industrial permit. So this is a change for those of you in Sector P. So your revised plan needs to address the entire industrial footprint. So that means if there's industrial activity and there's stormwater discharge from that area, you need to revise your plan and address the entire footprint where stormwater is discharging associated with industrial activity. So everyone needs to revise their stormwater pollution control plan. There is a revised checklist on the website, and those are due by August 31st, 2021. We have some electronic folders, email folders on the side of our website. You may submit those all over, although until we are fully in our electronic system, you still need to submit the signed copy or the signed page of your stormwater plan, the certification statement signed by the authorized representative. Those still need to be sent through the mail. We need original signatures on those. So you can submit the full plan, and we may be up and running in our electronic system for this submittal, but we don't have the timing quite yet. So let's go through the mapping really quick. This is the integrated reports webpage. Again, the web page hyperlinks will be available for you on the PDFs, so you can just click those if you haven't found these web page on our website yet. Becky Anthony's email is at the bottom. She is the assessment lead, and she can help you if you have specific questions. She's available for you. You can also click on her name on the webpage or give her a call at her office number. Hopefully that forwards to her cell phone, but you can leave a message either way. So here you can learn about the methodology changes. You can, this interactive story map is very informational. There's the web map and there's the assessment database. Those are the two tools that you will use. Again, I've been working with these for a month to determine impairments. I am very aware of the issues with the maps, and we are working on it. Your assessment unit ID is what you will be using is what we are identifying to you, and that is what you can use in the assessment database where you select assessment unit. Those 6 numbers is your assessment unit ID that will be identified on your monitoring tables. And that will, if you put that in, you don't have to do the select AU name or select integrated report category. There's many ways to search the database, but it looks different from the 2012 database. There was a complete overhaul of how we assess waters and how we view waters and how we identify waters, and a lot of delistings and new listings. So this effort made a lot of changes. So this is the new database where you can search. Again, you can search by AU name, which is actually the stream name. There are watershed units. Those are larger water bodies that have the smaller order streams in them. So that's a whole nother discussion, but again, the methodology and the story map will explain those to you. So you can either just put in the AUID that we identify on your monitoring tables. You can search by the stream name, and you want to select in the integrated category 5. You can also select by a pollutant if you know your receiving name, you could just select by pollutant. But again, what we are concerned with for the IR category is category 5. So this is what the map looks like. This is a watershed unit right here in the blue. These purple streams are impaired streams. And up at the search search engine, or the search where you search, you can put in your 6-digit AUID there, and it will oops, this is the Z, sorry, it will tell you what your category 5 receiving or your category 5 impairments are. So again, you can scroll into the map and find your water body. You can search by your AUID 6-digit identifier. You can search by your receiving stream. You want to have these clicked on the left-hand side to get the proper results. And the map will be changing. They are making some additional improvements to the map. So there'll be some new information and the map will look a little different, probably in a couple of weeks. So again, we know that the maps have had some issues, and we hope that the improvements and the changes that are made on our side are helping that. We also made a 1200Z map that shows all the registered facilities, has the georegion boundaries, and also has the integrated report units. Until that new layer is finished, which again should be in a couple weeks, they've been working on it, the impairment in the category 5 identifier when you click on your receiving stream on the 1200Z map isn't the best, but it will improve once the new tool is available to the public. So I'll pause there.
Okay, have a few questions specific to this. Is the assessment unit specific to a water body reach/river mile segment?
So the assessment unit ID is the unique identifier for either a segment, an estuary, or a watershed unit. They all have a unique AUID number. So it depends on it depends on your receiving water, and if you're in a watershed unit or your stream reach was assessed individually.
Okay, so along with that, Albert asked, the DEQ file number is assessment unit ID?
No, the DEQ file number is what we use right now, and that's how we identify you. That may change in the electronic system, so don't get too attached to the DEQ file number. The assessment unit ID is specific to your receiving stream and your impairment designation, and that will come when you receive your monitoring requirements from DEQ or agent. That will include your AUID, that 6-digit number. You don't have an AUID unless you've determined your own. We have never communicated that to you so far because this is a change.
Would a Sector P facility in the Portland Harbor be subject to Table 10 in Schedule E?
A Sector E?
A Sector P, as in Paul, facility in the Portland Harbor be subject to Table 10 in Schedule E?
No, Table 10 simply is the concentrations that apply if your sector-specific benchmarks require sampling for those metals. Sector P has no additional sector-specific benchmarks, so table 10, which is the metal concentrations, for those that do have those metals as a sector-specific benchmark, those concentrations only apply to those. Sector P has no benchmarks, so the table 10 does not apply.
And sorry for jumping around, but I'm asking you these as they come in. So multiple facilities in a common watershed could share an AU ID identification.
Yes, if they discharge to the same receiving stream, or if they're in a watershed unit, correct.
Okay. So regarding monthly visuals, stormwater will never look like tap water. So how much turbidity would constitute reportable amounts of settleable or suspended solids, assuming TSS is regularly less than benchmark?
Yeah, so the we took out settleable solids and as a requirement. So there was, you know, settleable solids, you have to actually take the sample and let it settle. So your visual observation no longer has to be has to determine settleable solids at all. Suspended solids and floating solids are still required as to be observed in your visual observation. And, you know, we don't give a threshold for that. So I don't really know how to answer that. If you've ever seen TSS sample over 100 milligrams per liter, maybe that could be your visual benchmark.
So are private roads where commercial vehicles are entering and exiting an industrial facility with separate stormwater drainage considered part of the industrial facility and need to be included in the SWIP?
I can't answer real specific questions like that. Rail lines, communication corridors, there are some requirements based on the egress and the way a facility enters and exits a site. If they're roads that go right to employee parking, no. Those specifics can likely be determined by looking at A1, Schedule A1, where is the narrative technology-based limits in the permit, and this and the SWIP requirements, which are A9, I believe, or ask your agent or DEQ staff. They'll be happy to help you with that determination.
Why don't we do one more before you move on? If Tier 1 is not evaluated until 2022, do you still have to do a Tier 1 corrective action on any single parameter exceedance? Or do you wait to evaluate any Tier 1 corrective actions until after 5 samples?
So Tier 2 is not evaluated until August 15th, 2022. Tier 1 requirements are corrective action requirements based on any single sample exceeding statewide or sector-specific benchmarks are required within 30 days of receiving your sample results.
Great. Okay, so we only have a few more, so let's go ahead and finish up and then we can I'll ask you these.
Oh, okay, sorry, that was me. Woo, I'm getting weary. Okay, so
Yeah, it's been a while.
quickly we'll go through DEQ Online, your DEQ Online. So we've been working on transitioning to electronic reporting for DMRs. And so once that happens, any new facilities, your DMR will be loaded into the electronic system. It will replace our mailing of monitoring tables to you and identifying your monitoring through any way outside of the system. The system will then be your DMR, and it will identify your monitoring. No more paper DMRs. Agents are not going to electronic reporting right away. So this is only applicable to DEQ administered sites. So again, it's not only DMR reporting, it will be a fully operable system. Hopefully, we will not be exchanging paper with our regulated entities any longer. So submission of renewal applications, paying invoices, checking the status of applications, payments, all that will happen through our electronic system soon. Once we move to our online system, we anticipate that the first DMR may be as soon as the November 15th, 2021 DMR under the new permit. And we expect to share more details soon. We're working to build this system, so the testing and the building of the system is taking longer than we had hoped. And so, until we have clarity and certainty on the system being operable, we can't give kind of final dates on when we're going to go. We expect to share more details very soon, including training sessions. Those will be coming in the upcoming months. We're going to communicate those through the industrial newsletters. So again, if you haven't signed up for that, go to the industrial webpage, open the technical assistant drop down, and you'll see the newsletters sign up. So you want to make sure you're signed up for that. We'll also be sending out notifications when the time is right through the mail, identifying each facility and making sure that you know that you must report electronically. And let's see, that's it. So let's finish these questions, and then I'll put up my contact information. And I appreciate everyone sticking with me. I know that was a lot, and I hope a lot of your questions were answered.
Yeah, there's a lot to this permit, so we expected a lot of questions. So Krista, will Tier 1 reports for impairments be submitted electronically?
There are no more Tier 1 reports for impairments. Currently, you are submitting Tier 1 if you have an exceedance of an impairment concentration within 60 days of receiving your monitoring results. That's going away. It's up to each facility, if you exceed an impairment concentration, to do what you need to do, or risk having 2 consecutive exceedances and escalating into narrative or numeric limits.
So regarding on your DEQ Online, will the data be accessible by the public other than the user? If so, will that include monitoring data results and the SWIP updates, etc.?
Yep, so right here, access to published records. Easily access to public records such as permit, licensing, and other public information. It's all going to be publicly available.
May consultants submit data for DMRs via the electronic reporting portal, or does it have to be a representative from the source?
Your lab or your consultant can upload monitoring results. It has to be certified by the facility.
Okay. So another question about the SWIP. Do you mean that the SWIP submitted will be eventually available online for others to see?
It depends on the timing for this revised SWIP submittal. So every existing facility registered under the 2021 permit needs to revise their SWIP and submit it to us on August 31st, 2021. We don't have clarity if the electronic system will be available then, and we don't have clarity on if we are going to scan and upload all those SWIPs that have already been submitted if the electronic system is not available.
Just to clarify, can you trigger tier 2 for E. coli in the Columbia Slough region?
You will not be assigned impairment monitoring for E. coli in the Columbia Slough. E. coli is a statewide benchmark, which if 4 samples, or if your samples exceed the geometric mean in any full monitoring year, July 1 through June 30, if it exceeds the geometric mean of the concentration, the 406, you will trigger tier 2 for E. coli in the Columbia Slough.
Are boiler and chiller tower blowdown considered industrial discharges if they are piped through the storm drain?
So I was anticipating this question and had our authorized non-stormwater discharge section of the permit open. We do have general permits, I believe, for both of those. They're probably expired. So what the permit says is incidental wind-blown mist from cooler towers or that collect on rooftops or adjacent portions of the facility must not intentionally discharge from the cooling towers. So that's for if you have cooler tower blowdown. So just look at condition 1, the first condition of the permit. Condition 1.6, page 8 of the permit for the authorized non-stormwater discharges.
More general question, as the permit holder in an industrial park with many tenants, we are the largest tenant, we are observing other tenants exhibiting behavior that is impacting our test results. We have reported but have not been heard. Where do we turn from here?
If your tenants have the industrial SIC code that requires permit coverage, you could require them to get their own permit coverage. If they do not meet the eligibility condition for the 1200Z, certainly reach out to your agent or regional staff. I mean, we're here to protect surface waters and decrease pollution. So we certainly are available to at least brainstorm ideas for you.
Yeah, there's a question similar to this about protecting waters that I'll ask you, and maybe if they're in a MS4 jurisdiction, that might be another alternative that they have to look into. So I'll ask that question now. I feel a need to ask, these waterways have outside polluters going into them not caused by industrial or industry, and that would not reduce industry's action needed. Sorry, that was a rough question. You can read it, and if you need to, Krista. Is DEQ and or the Public Water Bureau Working to solve those issues, what are the federal mandates for governing people polluters that are not industries? We put a lot of work into these waterways to keep them clean, and a lot of time and dollars, all for great necessary reasons. We do a disservice to know that, do we deserve to know if it's been looked at? Sorry. What data do we have and what can we see? This was in lines with that MS4 lead in. Maybe that is a little more beyond than what this webinar is, but if you have some input there, Krista, obviously that's a long question.
Yeah, we do, I mean, that's what TMDLs do. They address non-point source pollution. The municipalities have their own permits. If you're in a jurisdiction that is permitted under a phase 1 or phase 2 stormwater discharge permit, you can certainly talk to them. They have you know, that municipal jurisdiction has a permit that they're trying to protect and continue to, you know, they have their own restrictions and permit conditions they're abiding to, so they have an interest in anything discharging through their system, obviously. You know, the federal regulations set out the categories and the type of industries that are regulated. So, you know, commercial industries are not regulated under the Clean Water Act yet, but, you know, I guess that's my answer to that one.
Jason would like you to please verify that iron is no longer required for discharges to the Columbia Slough. And thanks, this was a very helpful discussion.
I believe that's accurate. I believe so. Yeah. Iron also, this was the thing I wanted to say when I was on that slide. Iron also has been removed from any sector specific benchmark based on EPA's and the National Academy's reports recommendation that, you know, aquatic life impacts are minimal based on iron. So we did our best to eliminate iron sampling based on, you know, all the factors that we could. And so iron has been removed from sector specific monitoring, and the 2018-2020 integrated report really, you know, looked at why waterways were listed for iron and evaluated those. And so I believe you are correct. Iron has been delisted, but don't quote me on that. Wait for your assignment letter. But I believe that's correct.
And two questions in one. Can you go over what needs to be included in the revised SWIP, or does DEQ have a SWIP template that would be easier for them to reference?
Yeah, that on the website, there's the 2021 revised SWIP checklist that needs to be submitted, and that includes everything that needs to be in your revised SWIP. So that's a real easy way to make sure that the SWIP is meeting the elements of the upcoming permit.
Okay. And Albert and Bruce both want more clarification on the iron, because they say that iron shows as an impairment pollutant with 10 parts per million limit for my Columbia Slough permit. And Albert says that iron is under his new permit as well.
Then it's not delisted in the SLIP.
Okay. What has DEQ seen as the best treatment or BMPs for zinc exceedances?
As a regulated, and as a regulator, I really can't speak to proprietary systems or what works the best. You know, that's something we hope to be tracking more in the electronic system, things like that. You know, right now we get tier 2 plans and we get SWIPs that have the control measures that facilities are installing and implementing. However, that was one of the difficulties in actually, you know, evaluating the technology, numeric technology limits. Is you need to know what is happening on the ground, what technologies folks are using, what kind of efficiency and pollutant reduction they're getting, and we just don't have that information readily at our fingertips. We don't even have the information of what every facility uses to reduce zinc loading, based on, you know, we have it in paper form, but we don't have it in electronic format where it's easily, you know, reportable, or we can quantify that. So I can't speak to what works the best or what sort of proprietary systems. We do have, you can reach out again to your regional staff, and there's some guidance on EPA's website, and there's some information out there for sure. We have a BMP manual on the industrial side under technology. It's pretty old, but it does have some things that work. It's based on pollutant. It's organized with pollutant in mind, so you can go to kind of think and then see the things that you may be able to use to reduce your zinc pollutants.
And if I could, Krista, one of the things about metal or any type of pollutant, it's also always very site specific as well. What's the hardness of the stormwater, the site itself, what are the other pollutants that you'll find? So usually an engineer can help with that, creating your SWIP. And also with that, Bruce suggests that you paint bare metal roofs and do regular sweeping of streets and traffic areas, which source control always works for any pollutant. So thanks, Bruce, for that. And last one, Krista, you're almost there, are the impairment concentrations in Table 5, Section B3, the limits to begin with, or are these limits the results of escalating to a numeric water quality based effluent limit? Or is the escalation those things listed in A13, F, G, and H, and setting up the compliance schedule in Section C? Wow. It's a lot to digest. So hopefully you can see that and you have your permit open to help out.
Yeah. So the concentrations in Table 5 are your impairment monitoring concentrations and your numeric limit concentrations. So they're one and the same. So the concentration will stay. It will just change to the type of monitoring you have. So it will change from an exceedance being, you know, it will change from, once it's a limit, an exceedance being a violation. And the specific A13 for the numeric are A13 E. That's the specifics to the numeric triggers and corrective action. So the triggers are 13A, and then F, G, and H are the specifics once you trigger, yes. And Schedule C is the section that you will follow once you have requested a compliance schedule within 30 days of your monitoring exceeding 2 consecutive for copper, lead, zinc, or pH. So yeah, it's all of those are what you want to, you know, keep your eye on.
Well, and with that, you almost hit 100 questions, 98 questions. So that's it, Krista.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. And I will get this up before too long to the website, and the link will link to the recording that will be available on YouTube, and the slides will be available. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Sorry we went over, and thank you for spending your time with us today.